Welcome to Accessibility Now, a production of the statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. I'm your host, Matt Shedd. Dana Lloyd is an advocate with the Georgia Advocacy Office. She lays out her journey into the vital civil rights work of advocacy for people with disabilities, from her early days of providing direct support to people with disabilities to her current role as PAD advocate. PAD stands for Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Developmental Disabilities. She educates us on the specific ways that mindsets about the disability community in different eras, including our own era, influence how society treats people with disabilities. She also provides us with a brief overview of PAD and the GAO's role as Georgia's dedicated protection advocacy network. We also talk about some of the current advocacy issues that are on her radar. So Dana, thank you so much for joining us. And I would really love to hear about your path to this work that you do at the GAO.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me, Matt. So my name's Dana Lloyd. I've been working at the Georgia Advocacy Office since about 2018. I've had lots of jobs before that, but I really kind of fell into the work of supporting people with disabilities. I just graduated college and was looking for a new job. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Some of the plans I had post-college had kind of fallen apart. And I was back in my hometown of Virginia Beach and ran into a friend. We'd gone to high school and to college together. And she said, hey, I've got this new job working for this agency supporting people with disabilities to live in their own homes. And I was like, I don't know. I don't really think that's what I want to do. I had been working in the juvenile court for a minute before that. I just wasn't sure that this was the work for me. And so she said, well, listen, we need to catch up anyway. Why don't you come over? We'll have dinner, we'll talk and all this. And so we do. And she says, well, our executive director reminds people in orientation that they're not just helping people go to the doctor and to the bank and grocery shop and keep their house up. As direct support professionals, you're really working in a civil rights movement. And as Brene Brown said, I thought she's just talking sweet to me, right? Like she just knows that will kind of pique my interest. But we had a great conversation. We caught up and, I was kind of interested. So I really kind of spent the next little bit of time just kind of questioning everything she said, right? I had not thought about what happened to people with disabilities, like literally after the school day in high school. I knew where special ed was, and it was definitely a place. I didn't know any of those students. And I remember the only interaction I'd ever had with students with disabilities in high school was I had a study hall, and my study hall was in the cafeteria. And that's when the kids with disabilities ate lunch. And I remember back then thinking that was weird. Like we could at least eat lunch together, right? And then I started thinking about that I hadn't thought about what happened to students with disabilities after high school, as in like college. I couldn't remember anyone with a disability on my college campus. It was a small school, but with 3,200 students, there should have been someone, right? And then I started looking around in the community going, well, like, I've been to the bank this week and I don't really see people. So all of that to say, I knew enough at that point to know that wasn't an accident, right? I knew enough about how oppression worked to know that something was afoot here. And that really kind of got me interested. So I called her back up. We had some more chats. I interviewed and started that job and was sure again that this wasn't the work for me, right? I really struggled in those first couple of weeks and months doing direct support. I am not a morning person. My shift started at 6 a.m. And I was kind of responsible for helping people get up and start their day. And there was this one gentleman who needed like a really like slow ease into the morning. And, he had a hearing impairment. So it was important to like not startle him. And there was another woman who, had pretty severe depression. So you needed to come in like a ball of sunshine. And I just knew I was going to get it wrong and I was going to mess something up. And, and I was young, right? I was like 22. And I remember going to my supervisor that time and saying like, I just don't think I can do this. Like I'm gonna mess something up. I'm too young and irresponsible. Like I shouldn't be in charge of people's health care. And this just isn't right. And she said, listen, because you care that much, like, let us help you figure it out. And I really credit that team at that agency that really said, like, yeah, like you can do this and we can figure it out. And that's how it all started. Honestly, I worked there for like 7, 8 years, part of that time in direct support, part of that time in like training and helping to support other workers kind of come on board. And I started doing some of orientation. And that was where I grew up in disability services and really kind of learned most of what I know. And then there's lots of other jobs in between. And then someone who I actually worked with at that organization in Norfolk, Virginia, moved back to Atlanta and started working for the GAO. I mean, we'd always stayed in touch. And she's telling me about the work that she's doing. And at that time, I'm thinking about what I know of the PNA in Virginia. I'm like, they do it real differently in Georgia. And so that was kind of intriguing. And yeah, so a position became available and I applied, and that's a whole nother long story, but eventually made my way to the GAO working in the developmental disabilities team. And that's the story. It's really been a story of like kind of having the curtain moved back just a little bit, right? And when someone did that for me, was able to help me kind of see and notice and pay attention to, I was kind of changed and wasn't really ever able to kind of go back to not noticing before. So yeah.
Looking back on those all those years in this work, what do you think is the biggest revelation to you that you've learned about?
I think it's that mindsets matter, right? I think about, we do this kind of review of the history of disability, and you can see how society's ideas about people with disabilities show up historically, right? So when the primary, I mean, we have all sorts of kind of stereotypes about people with disabilities, but when the primary lens was that people with disabilities were dangerous, we built jails and prisons, right? And people always away and apart, always separated. But when that was the primary thought, the way we warehouse people, unfortunately, was in a way that was really based on people kind of being criminalized, right? And I mean this over history, like 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, right? And when that shifted and we started thinking of people as, well, maybe they're not criminals, they just don't have enough to do, right? People need kind of this rehabilitation sort of model. Then we see farms kind of spring up as the way. And when people are seen primarily as sick, it's hospitals. And when people are seen primarily as children, it's schools, right? And so we can see the way we think about people with disabilities in societies show up. And that surprises me, right? In that it is so strong. Our mindsets about people, our unconscious bias will inform the way we build society. And then I think the other thing for me is that, and I believe this kind of across the board, that all of society's ills really boil down to this idea of other. That person is not like me. That person is not human like me. That person doesn't have hopes and wishes and dreams like me. And so therefore, I'm not really concerned what happens to them. I'm not really concerned that they have the same opportunities and privileges that I do. And as society, you can see that too, right? That we cluster together and we live in this place of us and them. And that the minute we can begin to deconstruct that, right? I remember the moment where I kind of was like, yeah, like I have more in common with people with disabilities because we're people, right? The disability thing like shows up, and yes, that really impacts people's lives personally and how they get through society and all of that. But there's a commonality just because we're people, just because we're living on this planet together. And I think that those two things have been like central to me and the work that I've done, right? That because if I can hold that, then I kind of know what I'm up against and I can think about how to help other people kind of shift their mindset and make that connection to people just on a individual basis. And and you can still see that show up, right? We read policy and budgets and legislation all the time, and you can still see the way we think about people show up. And often when we're trying to do work to make those changes, we have to help people kind of question those fundamental assumptions, right? Because for sure, if nothing else still shows up in our society, and plenty does, but if nothing else, the fact that people with disabilities should be away and apart every day, right? That is still a primary. People need something special. People need safety and security in kind of a overprotection sort of way. That still shows up in legislation and in policy all day, every day. And so helping people kind of question, well, why is that? Why do you think that way? And might it be true that there's a different way to get to that same outcome for people? Because people have a variety of needs, but I believe and have seen over and over again, those needs can be met and often met better in community and relationship and all of these sorts of things. So I think those two fundamental kind of assumptions have been bedrock to my career, and not just for people with disabilities. I worked for a time in refugee services. I worked for a time in homeless services. I worked for a time, fill in the blank, right? But those, having the lens of what's the assumption, so then how do we combat that, has been helpful.
I think that's a great segue for us to talk more specifically about protection and advocacy for individuals with developmental disabilities, or PAD. And could you kind of just explain what that is for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PNA network was created.
That Protection and Advocacy Network?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Protection and Advocacy was created in the 70s after, I love saying this, like at one point in his career, Geraldo Rivera was a hard-hitting investigative journalist. And so there's the expose of Willowbrook that turns into the documentary Christmas in Purgatory. And so Geraldo Rivera and a cameraman and a couple of people who are working at this institution, Willowbrook State School, kind of conspire together to film the conditions of this state school, right? So we're back to thinking about how people with disabilities are imaged at that time. And the conditions are horrible. And they quickly realize no one is being educated, no one is being treated. This is not, right? If what people need is education and treatment, people are not getting it. And that becomes the impetus of the creation of the Protection and Advocacy Network. And the first program of the Protection and Advocacy Network was the program for people with developmental disabilities. Of course, it had a different name at its inception, but that was the group of people that were being looked upon as needing the most support. And the idea was that people needed access to civil and legal protections, right? And that they needed an organization that would advocate on their behalf, hence the name. And so GAO has been Georgia's protection and advocacy system since 1977. We've been the first and only designated protection and advocacy system here in Georgia for that entire time. What is also unique about our founding is that when kind of asked that question, the people in the mix at that time doing that work, when kind of asked, what did people with disabilities most need for their protection and advocacy? The folks in Georgia actually had two answers to that question. And one were the legal and civil supports that became the Georgia Advocacy Office, but the other was that people needed relationships, right? And so that becomes, in Georgia, a citizen advocacy program that has been, again, kind of central to the way we see the world, right? So I often say GAO and citizen advocacy are kind of two trees that grew out of the same soil. And so, and I we work in kind of close relationship with each other, continuing to ask that question. What do people most need? Yes, people need protection and advocacy, but people need freely given relationships. And I think about, there's a George Takei quote that says, if there's never been a Supreme Court case to decide if you have the same rights as others, that's a privilege, right? And so in some ways, I think we trade on that as well, right? Like, yes, we want there to be protection and advocacy, and there may need to be lawsuits, and there may need to be, advocacy, navigation, and mediation. That may be necessary. But what would the world look like if it wasn't necessary, right? If we were all working under that assumption of, as I'm advocating for people with disabilities, or maybe all people with the same kind of emphasis and oomph as I want for my own life, right? What would that look like? And so now the PNA network, the Protection and Advocacy Network, includes several programs outside of people with developmental disabilities, TBI, mental illness, all sorts of work there. But at GAO, the PAD team works to make sure that those things are true for people with developmental disabilities, right? Their human and civil rights are protected. They have access to the services and supports they need in their community, and they're free from abuse and neglect. Those are our priorities for all people with disabilities. So, in some ways, in the developmental disabilities arena for the last several years, that's looked a lot like access to home and community based services. So, making sure that people know about Medicaid waivers, can get through the process of applying for Medicaid waivers, advocating for additional Medicaid waivers and expansion of waiver services. That looks like making sure that the services that people receive, whether that's within that home and community based service system, are adequate to their needs, that they're not experiencing abuse and neglect, that they perhaps are more than adequate and actually helping people, thrive and accomplish all the things that we want to accomplish. So that's kind of the overview of how we've gotten here, and then what some of the priorities are currently for people experiencing developmental disabilities at GAO.
That's great. I guess my next question is, what has the collaboration looked like with Silk GA over, at least in terms of your experience working at the GAO?
Yeah, that's a great question. So GAO works to be a collaborative partner, with organizations who are trying to accomplish the same things we're trying to accomplish, right? And so when we think about the Centers for Independent Living and the Statewide Independent Living Council, that work looks like perhaps partnering on. So a couple of years ago, we were working with Silk on like a voting rights kind of project for folks, specifically for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So using each other's network to promote information. I think probably most of that collaboration has been in kind of the education and outreach space. GAO participates on the Silk's Advisory Council. So thinking about, as you all set priorities and metrics and those sorts of things, bringing a different voice and lens to that conversation. GAO spends a lot of time, probably the longest session or maybe the second longest session in our orientation is session on independent living philosophy, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about that and how it's, how it informs our work, and then what we should be looking for in services and supports for people. And so, I often think, a lot of the organizations that we work with, it's kind of that, we might not have like a strategic plan together, but it's the idea of like, hey, we're doing this thing and we're trying to move something forward. How can you help? And then being on the other end of the phone when the call comes to say, well, how can you help? And so we work in those ways together. When during the pandemic and after the pandemic, we had several vaccine events and vaccine education events, and the Centers for Independent Living were essential to those as being kind of embedded in their community. So GAO serves the entire state, but our offices are in Georgia, right? So it's great to have partners. We know plenty of folks in Macon and Athens and all the places that centers are, but the centers definitely have, close ties to their communities. And so being able to connect with and liaise with them has been great. And often that first point of contact has been with the Silk to kind of start those conversations. And also to ask, right? Sometimes it's just a matter of, hey, this has come to our attention as an issue. What do you all know about that? Our centers reporting similar issues? Oh, that's not been a part of what's been reported to us. Great. We can help we can add that to our kind of plan now. So it's definitely a collaborative relationship where I, feel like I can pick up the phone to any of the centers, or to the Silk itself and kind of start a conversation about, what are you seeing, what's happening, and how can we work together to support folks with disabilities in Georgia?
That's great. I love that open kind of collaborative relationship is so important when you're doing this work that can feel, I'm sure, insurmountable at times. And on that note, I guess my last question would be what's what's kind of at the top of your docket and right now when you think of obstacles or challenges that need to be addressed?
Yeah, so it's always hard to prioritize that list. But one of the things that we're working on right now in the realm of making sure that people are free from abuse and neglect is that folks can currently experience abuse and neglect from some sort of service provider. And if that incident isn't reported to law enforcement, that person isn't then criminally charged and convicted, the person alleged or then substantiated to have committed the abuse and neglect can continue to work in the service system, right? It's only when it rises to the point of a criminal conviction that will show up on a background check, then people are kind of screened out. And there's many reasons why. Someone could be substantiated, could have been found by a state agency or by us to have committed abuse or neglect, and that does not then get criminally convicted, right?
Wow.
There's a lot of things that can happen in that process that would, keep things from making it all the way to a
It's pretty
conviction.
shocking.
Right. Yeah. And so that's something that we're working on right now is to figure out a way to impact that, right? What would it look like to change that? Because unfortunately, we find people, right? We find people who, abuse someone at provider A, and then 2 years later, they're at provider B, and there's another allegation of abuse and neglect, right? And so, what would it look like to try to intervene there and protect people with disabilities from people who are bad actors, are people who need additional training and support that they're not getting from providers, whatever the reason is? It doesn't really matter if people with disabilities are still in jeopardy of that abuse and neglect. And unfortunately, a criminal background check just doesn't catch that always. So that's one of the major things that are kind of happening in PAD right now. That's outside of kind of our general priorities of working towards community based access for people. Another project that I lead is our supported decision making project. So making sure that people have access to all the supports that they might need to hold on to autonomy and be decision makers in their life and not be subject to guardianship, or if they are subject to guardianship, looking at rights restoration. We're always thinking about voting rights and voter suppression as it affects people with disabilities. So as we gear up for the election, there's a lot more work happening with that currently. So those are probably the things that, again, are kind of outside of, and none of them are ever outside of, but outside of kind of the typical processes where we're supporting people, because we get calls about people in a hospital where, a medical professional has said, well, I'm not sure you need this surgery or procedure because you have Down syndrome, right? So those are the everyday things. Unfortunately, I say, no one calls the GAO because they're having a good day, right? So a lot of the work that we're doing in that space of offering protection and advocacy for people is difficult and kind of perennial. But those are a couple of things that are I won't even say on the top of the list, but just kind of outside of the scope of the typical things that we're doing all day, every day right now.
Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
some of that you just communicated is just really surprising. And yeah, well, thank you. And I mean, this whole conversation has just been thoroughly educational, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's always good to connect with the Silk and think about the work that the GAO is doing. And I think, your comment about, kind of some of the things that we're up against being surprising. Unfortunately, I think that's true for a lot of people, right? That folks aren't really knowledgeable about what people with disabilities and especially people with developmental disabilities are kind of up against in the world. And so that's one of the things that we try to do, right, in the education and outreach space. Not only is it helping folks in the community know if something's not going right, if you feel like there's something you need access to that you can't get, or there's someone that you care about who's experiencing abuse and neglect, GAO is there. Contact us. We have a website and email addresses and a phone number, that like an 800 number that's available. We want folks to contact us and let us know what's going on, so we then can connect them to ways to mitigate that. We are a small office. There's about 30 of us that serve the entire state. So not everyone is going to get that one-on-one advocacy, and we hope not everyone needs legal representation, but we have lots of different ways that we work to try to help people connect to some solutions in their life. But also, I think it's easy for all of us who kind of work in our own little lanes, right, to miss what's kind of happening globally for folks with disabilities. And that's one of the things I love about working at GAO, because we do have, the programs for, if you live in the state of Georgia and you have a disability, you're eligible for our services, right? That's it. That's the only eligibility requirement. And so we do have that kind of more holistic sense of what's going on for folks. But even within our offices, right, we chat with each other. Oh, I didn't know this thing is going on with you guys in employment. Oh, we see how that's showing up in, the space for folks with mental illness. And so it's important for us as disability serving organizations to have these types of conversations, because unfortunately, it's that framework of, you have to be like really proactive, because the physics phrase, and I only know this because my kid just did physics this year, but entropy is in the system, right? The system is not working towards getting better in any way, shape, or form, right? It is falling apart all the time. And so then as people who want a better system, want a different system, we have to be thinking about kind of how we hold it together and then move it forward. And so it takes that kind of cross training and education with each other. So that's one of the reasons I happily said yes when you guys asked me to join this conversation. And, one of the reasons that I try to stay so connected to other orgs doing the work, because I think it's super important for us to be really kind of focused on the way those mindsets show up. And somehow we got to get like better than the systems of oppression, right? We've got to get quicker and faster than they are. And I think staying in good contact with each other helps us do that. So thanks for inviting me, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dana. Accessibility Now is a production of the statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. I'm your host, Matt Shedd. Thank you for joining us. And we'll sign off by saying that a Georgia that includes all of us is better for everyone.